Hello, my name is Michael Stanaitis, and I'd like to welcome you to SISG-763, which is the Quantitative Methods course for the online programs here at the School of International Service at American University. And I have uploaded this pre-week 1 live session video on developing a good research question so we can hit the ground running with this class and make sure you all have a research question that is amenable to the type of quantitative analysis we'll be doing in this class. So let's get started. First, briefly, I'll be going over the following items in this video. First, I'll touch on what to do before the first live session that we have next week. I'll also talk about the week 1 activity, which is where each of you will be posting 2 research question ideas, each of which should adhere to the very strict research question template that I will be presenting at the back end of this video. After touching on the week 1 activity, I'll talk about different types of analysis we can do in quantitative analysis and the type of analysis we will, for better or worse, be stuck with due to the type of statistical software package we're using in this class. From that, I will talk about how each of you should go about developing a good research question for this class, and a large part of that will include the research question template, which I will mandate all of your questions adhere to. So before our first live session, of course, you should take a look at the welcome and course overview video, and there are also readings from Baglioni, Pollock, and Luker. Also under readings, though not readings per se, they're sort of handouts that you should take a look at now, but also that you likely will consult with in the future, is the citation guide and the guidelines for asynchronous discussion. Additionally, there's a handout on how to develop a good research question. You should read this handout thoroughly before attempting the week 1 activity, but also know that this video is meant to accompany that handout and ideally bring the words in that handout somewhat to life, in as much as a PowerPoint video like this can bring anything to life. So, the week 1 activity. You will be posting 2 research question ideas. Both questions should adhere strictly to the cross-national research question template that I mandate and will present later in this video. You should provide some information for each question that addresses why it's interesting, important, and/or puzzling. In other words, why is it worth researching a question like this? How do scholars find it interesting? How do policymakers find it interesting? What's the utility of researching a question like this? And you should be posting this 48 hours prior to our first live session and commenting on at least 2 other students' posts 24 hours prior to the live session. So, as with a lot of asynchronous activities in other courses in this program, you're both posting and commenting on other posts in order to receive full credit for the activity. So, quantitative analysis falls into 3 broad types, 3 broad categories that are all based on what we are comparing to one another and what we are not allowing to vary. All quantitative analysis is inherently comparative, in which we allow some things to vary and some things not to vary. So, in the first category, which we would call cross-sectional analysis, this would be where we're allowing space to vary. We're comparing across spatially delimited units. In international relations, the sort of natural spatially delimited unit is country, and we would call this cross-national analysis. This is sometimes colloquially referred to as a snapshot in time, because time is the thing that we're not allowing to vary. Cross-sectional analysis or cross-national analysis would usually mean we're only observing this in 1 year or 1 quarter. In other words, time is not varying at all. On the other hand, where we allow time to vary but we hold space constant in a sense, this would be where we would be looking within one spatially delimited unit but comparing that unit across temporally delimited units. So if we were to look at one country but across time, and this would be either yearly or quarterly delimited units that are the temporally delimited units. And then panel data analysis, where we combine both of them. We allow both space and time to vary, in a sense. So each spatially delimited unit, or country, has several temporally delimited units, years or quarters. And thus, whereas with cross-sectional analysis, the unit of analysis is country, time series analysis, the unit of analysis is year, with panel data analysis, or cross-sectional time series analysis, the unit of analysis is called country year. Cross-sectional data, just really to visualize it here, this is from 2013, so I realize that now this is 5 years old, which then should demonstrate to all of you how long I've been teaching this class for. But these are GDP figures from 2013, a bar graph of all countries that are included in the World Bank World Development Indicators database. And we see here just the nominal GDP in 2013 for all countries. We see that this is a highly skewed distribution. There are a lot of countries out there with very little GDP and very few with a lot. And I've highlighted 3 countries of interest here, the US, China, and India. So we sort of see where they fall in the distribution. Again, comparing across spatially delimited units, but it's just a snapshot in time, 1 year. And this is what at least the first several rows of these data would look like in Excel, with the country name and then the corresponding 2013 GDP figure. Time series, again, this would be where we do not allow space to vary. So we're only looking within one spatially delimited unit, in this case the US, but we're allowing time to vary. So we're looking at US GDP across time from 1960 to 2013. And time series, whereas cross-sectional data usually is best observed in a bar graph, time series data is usually expressed visually in a line graph, so we can sort of see the trend over time. And this is what those data would look like in Excel, once again, where the country would not vary, but the year would, and each year's corresponding GDP figure. Finally, bringing back those 3 that I highlighted from the bar graph from our cross-sectional visualization, we've got panel data, time series cross-sectional data, where we have several temporally delimited units, in this case 3. This would be considered a rather thin panel, and then it only has 3 countries. But all of those spatially delimited units are also observed across time, so we've got variation both across space and time. And in Excel, this would look just like the last slide, except we would also have rows for China and India. So, for better or worse, due to the statistical software package we'll be using for this class, we are limited to cross-sectional analysis. And since in international relations, country is sort of the natural unit of analysis, and countries are pretty good at collecting data on themselves, there's a lot of country-level data available, I'm going to have you all use country as your unit of analysis, and thus you will all be doing cross-national analysis. So you should be developing your research question with a cross-national analysis mindset. Thinking about what kinds of questions do you have about variation across countries? What kinds of things do we wonder about why some countries are like this and some countries like that, in other words? With GDP per capita, right, we could ask ourselves, why are some countries rich and some countries poor? With regime type, we could ask ourselves, why are some countries more democratic than others? This is the kind of mindset we should be in for thinking about our research question in this class. So, for developing a research question, it's probably the most challenging and least intuitive step in the research process. The goal is not only to find a question that can be answered and is interesting, but also that is amenable to quantitative analysis. And in this sense, what I want to introduce first are sort of the disparate parts of a research question, the anatomy of a research question, and then we'll look at an example of a type of analysis we'll do in this class, and we'll trace ourselves back to based on an analysis, what is the research question that that analysis seeks to answer? And that will be the way that we will introduce the cross-national research question template. So, the anatomy of a research question, the disparate parts of a research question. First, the dependent variable. The dependent variable is the phenomenon that you're seeking to explain. In particular, you're seeking to explain variation in this phenomenon. So, for example, I asked that question before about why are some countries rich and some countries poor? In that case, the dependent variable would be wealth. We're seeking to explain variations across countries in wealth. The unit of analysis, which for all of you will be country, as I mandate, but still important that you explicate the unit of analysis within your research question. And then independent variables. These are the factors that you propose to explain variation in your dependent variable. So this question about wealth, why some countries rich and some countries poor, this is a question that has been asked over the ages in international relations among both political scientists and economics and economists and sociologists. And to some extent, it's a question we still don't completely know the answer to. There's still some unexplained variation, so to say, for this question. But one independent variable that many scholars have pointed to is regime type, that perhaps regime type is a determinant of wealth. In other words, perhaps democracies, on average, exhibit a higher level of GDP per capita than autocracies. And if we were to hypothesize that, we would be setting ourselves up for a question in which wealth is our dependent variable, country is our unit of analysis, and our independent variable is regime type. Now, let's take a look at a type of analysis we'll be doing in this class. This graph here exhibits what we would call a scatter plot, in which we have the independent variable, which is GDP per capita, on the x-axis. And then on the y-axis, we have average life satisfaction on a 10-point scale. And we might infer that these data for the dependent variable were ascertained using some kind of survey instrument. People went out into all of these different countries and conducted surveys on how people felt about their lives on a scale of 1 to 10, or 0 to 10. And each of these dots represents the average life satisfaction for that country and the GDP per capita for that country. So we have sort of the coordinate for each of these countries. And if we look at this, it seems that we have sort of a positive trend that as GDP per capita increases, so does average life satisfaction, begging the question, maybe can wealth buy happiness? Can money buy happiness? And certainly from this data analysis we're seeing thus far, it seems that the answer could be yes. If we had a good enough sort of causal argument, we could argue that. So going back to the anatomy of a research question, in this graph we have country as the unit of analysis, we have average life satisfaction as the dependent variable, and we have GDP per capita as the independent variable, the thing seeking to explain variation in our dependent variable. So wouldn't our research question then be, to what extent does GDP per capita affect life satisfaction? And the answer to that question is no. That is not our research question, even though it seems like it should be. That would be intuitive that if it were, but it falls into one of the common mistakes made with research questions in quantitative analysis. One of these mistakes is speculative questions. What if, how does, what will? These are sort of what I like to call crystal ball questions. They're questions we'd love to know the answers to, but we really can't attack with the types of methods we'll be using. So we don't really like to ask these types of questions then, because the methods that we use don't help us answer them. Yes or no questions, right? If you can answer your research question with a yes or a no, it's not a good research question. And then the type of mistake that our previous incorrect research question based on the scatter plot participates in, a narrow focus on a specific explanatory factor. To what extent or degree does X affect Y? And we don't want to ask a question like that because it narrows our focus too much, and it doesn't fulfill all the objectives we want from a good quantitative analysis research question. So let me go over that. A good quantitative analysis research question is open-ended. It doesn't mention any independent variables. In fact, it allows the dependent variable really to be the star of the show. It's explanatory. It makes it very clear that the question is focused on explaining variation among some sets of units. And as I mentioned before, it clearly explicates the unit of analysis, which for all of you will be country. So, the kind of research question that would fulfill all of those objectives would be something like this. What factors account for the variation among units of analysis regarding insert dependent variable? And if we go back to our scatter plot, the way that we would fill in this research question template would be what factors account for the variation among countries regarding life satisfaction. And if we take life satisfaction out of it and we generalize this, we get to the cross-national research question template that I will mandate all of you use, not just for the week 1 activity, but for the entire class. What factors account for the variation among countries regarding insert dependent variable? Which means, yes, the 9 first words of all of your research questions will be identical. What factors account for the variation among countries regarding? And the part that you get to fill in is the dependent variable, which seems that it doesn't give you a lot of freedom, but when we think about how focal the dependent variable is to our inquiry, it really does allow you a lot of room to personalize your inquiry. So, your attempt then to obtain a research question for this class is little more than finding a good dependent variable. So how do we do that? Well, first, your dependent variable should exhibit distribution. It should vary across countries. A variable that doesn't vary is not a variable at all. It's a constant. So we want it to vary. Moreover, we want it to vary in an interesting or puzzling way. As I mentioned before, we should wonder, why are some countries like this and some countries like that? And finally, though very importantly, it should be feasible, meaning there should be readily available data available. There should be readily available data for the dependent variable. And for this, I suggest that students, whatever your dependent variable is, if we do what factors account for the variation among countries regarding democratization, you could Google data on democratization by country. Whatever your dependent variable is, data on insert dependent variable by country. And then in that first page of hits, you'll see pretty readily whether there are country-level data sets on that concept, which I can tell you for democratization, there certainly are. You can also take a look ahead at the week 6 readings, which include several links for commonly used country-level data sets in international relations. Some additional requirements. What really distinguishes quantitative analysis from qualitative analysis is the number of observations, the number of cases. Qualitative analysis is small n, a small number of cases, whereas quantitative analysis is large n, a large number of cases. For our purposes, we want as close to 100 countries as possible. Ideally, we want to include all countries for which data are available, but at a minimum, we want no less than 50 countries. Once we get to 50 or below, that's really when the types of analyses we'll be doing lose their ability to give us interesting findings. You could run the analysis, but you're not really going to find anything. Also, we won't formally cover levels of measurement until week 4, but for the time being, I want you to know that your dependent variable needs to be what we call interval ratio level of measurement. So there are 3 levels of measurement: nominal, ordinal, interval ratio. Your dependent variable needs to be interval ratio. Things like number of wars, percentages, GDP, anything when we double it, we know that's exactly twice as much as the former figure. So 40,000 GDP per capita is exactly twice as much as 20,000 GDP per capita. Right? That's a hallmark of interval ratio data. It doesn't as clearly apply to something like average life satisfaction, which was on a 10-point scale. For instance, when you ask people, how do you feel about your lives on a scale of 0 to 10, we can't say that 8 is exactly 2 times as much as 4. People are not necessarily thinking about their happiness in that precise way. So that thus would be ordinal rather than interval ratio. So if it helps you think about, we're looking for dependent variables with a high level of precision, when we're not just able to rank the scores and say this is higher than that, but we're able to say something precise about the distance between scores, that they are equal, right? That an 8 would be twice as much as a 4, and so on. For the time being, I don't want you to worry too much about this, but I want you to know that your dependent variable needs to be interval ratio. We'll cover levels of measurement formally in week 4. And in the interim, if you have any questions about data you're coming across and you're wondering whether it's interval ratio or not, your last lifeline is always just to email it to me, right? And I can tell you whether it's interval ratio or not. And if I can't figure it out, then we need to look for new data, right? If it isn't clear. Finally, this is the last slide I'll be showing you. These are methodological requirements for the final paper that I mandate beyond what is on the final research paper assignment page. There's going to be a lot of information on the slide that doesn't make sense to you right now. I want to go ahead and dwell on the items I have at least touched on in this video. But for the time being, know that you'll see this slide again and again. We'll be sort of notching items off of this slide as we cover them. And this will be an iterative process where you'll end up seeing the slide more than you ever wanted to by the end of this course. So first, dependent variables interval ratio. I've touched on that. We'll cover it in more extensively week 4, but no, for now, it should be interval ratio. Unit of analysis is country. This is already required from the mandated cross-national research question template. So as long as you use that template, you're good to go on number 2 here. Research design includes a flowchart of your theoretical model. We'll see an example of a causal flowchart in Michael Ross's article on oil, Islam, and women, which we'll be reading over the next few weeks. And you will be submitting a causal flowchart of your own week 12. But for the time being, know that it's supposed to be included in your final research paper. We'll cover it more extensively as the weeks go on. Analysis includes at least one multivariate regression analysis. This is why your dependent variable needs to be interval ratio, because I'm requiring you to use regression analysis in your final research paper. We will cover regression analysis in week 9. A correlation matrix of all independent variables is reported. And correlation matrices are something, again, we'll cover in week 9, and I'll explain how you'll be using it in the context of your final research paper more extensively in week 12. So for the time being, really, don't worry about the last 3. We'll be covering them further in the course, and the first 2 items I've at least touched on. This is my last slide. I hope that this relatively short video, helps you develop good research questions for the week 1 activity. And I look forward to seeing those posts and seeing you all next week. In the interim, be well and do good work.